It was an ordinary Sunday morning in the heart of a small, picturesque town. The sun filtered gently through the stained glass windows of the church, casting vibrant patterns on the pews and the gathered congregation. The scent of polished wood and fresh flowers filled the air, and the choir's soft melodies created an atmosphere of peace and reverence. Families sat together, heads bowed in prayer while children fidgeted quietly beside their parents. It was a moment of unity, solace, and faith. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors swung open with a loud creak that echoed through the sanctuary, drawing every pair of eyes toward the entrance. A woman, seemingly in her early 40s, stormed in with a determined and almost frantic energy. Her appearance was disheveled, her hair unkempt, her clothes rumpled as if she had hurriedly thrown them on before arriving. Her face was flushed with emotion, and her hands trembled as she clenched them at her sides. She took several steps forward, her heels clicking sharply against the stone floor, before stopping near the middle aisle. Without hesitation or preamble, she threw her hands into the air and shouted at the top of her lungs, "God doesn't exist!" Her voice reverberated off the high ceilings, louder than the church bells had been earlier that morning. For a moment, the entire congregation sat frozen in shock, as though time itself had stopped. The priest, midway through his sermon, stood dumbfounded at the pulpit. Parishioners whispered in hushed tones, exchanging incredulous glances. A few clutched their rosaries tightly, their lips moving in silent prayer, while others stared at the woman with wide-eyed disbelief. The tranquil sanctity of the church had been shattered in an instant. The woman stood her ground, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling as if she had just run a great distance. Her eyes scanned the room, defiant yet brimming with unshed tears. No one knew what to do. A few members of the congregation instinctively rose from their seats, unsure whether to approach her or to retreat. A sense of unease swept over the church as people wondered what could possibly compel someone to enter a sacred place and make such a bold and provocative statement. In the midst of the growing tension, one elderly man near the back whispered, "What's wrong with her?" while a young woman sitting in the front row looked up at the priest as if silently pleading for guidance. The atmosphere was heavy with confusion and anxiety, and it was clear that no one had expected the serenity of their worship to be disrupted in such a dramatic fashion. The pastor, an older man with a kind and measured demeanor, slowly descended from the pulpit. He raised a hand, signaling for calm, and began walking toward the woman. His steps were steady, his expression neutral but attentive. The woman's gaze locked onto him as he approached, her shoulders stiffening as though preparing for a confrontation. The whispers among the congregation subsided, leaving an almost eerie silence punctuated only by the faint creak of the pastor's footsteps on the wooden floor. "Miss," the pastor said softly, his voice calm and steady, "this is a house of peace. Whatever brought you here today, we are willing to listen. Please, tell us what's on your heart." The woman's eyes flickered with a mixture of anger and pain. For a moment, she seemed to consider his words, but then her emotions boiled over once again. "You think you're willing to listen?" she shouted, her voice breaking. "You think God listens? He doesn't exist. He's a lie, just like everything else in this world." Her words were filled with venom, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of despair that tugged at the hearts of those who heard her. The congregation erupted into whispers once again, some sounding concerned, others skeptical. A middle-aged man sitting near the aisle muttered under his breath, "She's just trying to make a scene." But another voice, that of a young mother holding her child, said softly, "She's hurting. Can't you see it?" The pastor took a cautious step closer to the woman, maintaining eye contact. "I don't know your story," he said gently, "but I can see the pain in your eyes. If you're willing, we are here to hear you out. No judgment, no condemnation, just open hearts." The woman's posture faltered slightly, her shoulders sagging as the weight of his words seemed to reach her. Her lip trembled, and for a fleeting moment, it appeared she might relent. But then she shook her head furiously, her hands balled into fists. "You don't understand," she cried. "None of you do. You sit here praying to a God that doesn't care, praying to a God that lets people suffer, that lets good people die." Her voice cracked, and tears began streaming down her face. The pastor's expression softened further, and he gestured for the congregation to remain seated as he extended a hand toward her, not to touch, but to show her that she was not alone. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper now, "tell us your story. Let us understand." The woman looked around the room, her chest heaving with emotion. She was surrounded by faces, some judgmental, some compassionate, but all captivated by the raw honesty of her anguish. For a moment she seemed torn, caught between the urge to flee and the need to unburden herself. Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath, she spoke. What she said next would leave everyone in the church speechless. The woman stood in the center aisle, her chest rising and falling as she tried to steady her breath. Her face was flushed, streaked with tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. The congregation was frozen, a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and compassion etched across their faces. The pastor remained nearby, close enough to show he was present, but far enough to give her space to decide how much she wanted to share. Finally, she began to speak, her voice trembling but clear enough to carry through the silent room. "You want to know why I'm here? You want to know what brought me into this place?" She looked around, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "I didn't come here to find answers. I didn't come here because I believe in your God. I came here because I'm angry. Angry at all of you, angry at the world, angry at him, if he's even real." The church remained silent, every person hanging on her every word. She hesitated, her hands clutching the back of a nearby pew for support. "A month ago," she continued, her voice cracking, "I buried my little boy. He was 7 years old, 7. Her words hit the room like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the congregation, and a few people instinctively brought their hands to their mouths. Her voice grew louder, fueled by a mixture of grief and fury. He was the sweetest, most beautiful soul, always laughing, always finding something to smile about, even when we didn't have much. And then he got sick, so sick. The doctors didn't know what to do. They said it was some rare condition, something they couldn't fix. And I prayed. Oh, I prayed so hard." Her voice cracked again and she clenched her fists, struggling to contain the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I prayed every single day. I begged God, your God, to save him. I begged and I begged and I begged. And you know what happened? Nothing. Nothing happened. He just got worse until one day he was gone." Her knees buckled slightly and she collapsed onto the pew, covering her face with her hands. The pastor took a step closer, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't," she said firmly, her voice muffled but still strong. "Don't tell me he's in a better place. Don't tell me it was part of some divine plan. Don't tell me God works in mysterious ways. I've heard it all before, and it's meaningless." A few members of the congregation wiped away tears, moved by the rawness of her pain. A young man in the back quietly whispered, "I can't even imagine," to his wife, who nodded silently. The pastor knelt on the floor, bringing himself to her eye level but still giving her the space she needed. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he said gently. "There are no words that can take away your pain, and I won't pretend to have answers that make sense of it all. But I'm here to listen, and so is everyone in this room." The woman's hands dropped from her face, revealing eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked at him with a mixture of bitterness and sorrow. "Listen?" she asked bitterly. "What good does listening do? Will it bring him back? Will it erase the nights I spent holding him while he cried in pain? Will it give me back the life I had before everything fell apart?" The pastor didn't flinch at her harsh tone. Instead, he nodded solemnly. "No, it won't. And I won't insult you by pretending it will. But I believe that sharing your story, your truth, can help you carry the burden even if just a little. You shouldn't have to face this alone." For a moment, the woman simply stared at him, as if weighing his sincerity. Then, as though something inside her finally broke free, she began to speak again, her words spilling out in a torrent. She talked about her son, his love of drawing, his fascination with animals, the way he used to sing songs he made up on the spot. She described his illness in painful detail, the hospital visits, the treatments that didn't work, the hope that slowly turned to despair. As she spoke, the congregation listened intently, their initial shock giving way to deep empathy. Some bowed their heads in silent prayer, others wiped away tears as they imagined the depth of her loss. A mother near the front held her own child a little closer, her eyes glistening. The woman's voice softened as she recounted her final moments with her son, holding his hand as he slipped away. "I told him it was okay to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I told him I'd be fine, even though I wasn't, even though I'm not." Silence fell over the church once more, heavy and profound. No one dared to speak, as if any words would break the fragile spell of her confession. The pastor, still kneeling nearby, finally spoke, his voice quiet and filled with compassion. "Thank you for sharing your story. Your pain is real, and so is your anger. I can't claim to understand the depths of your grief, but I do know that you are not alone. We are here for you." The woman's eyes filled with tears again, but this time, they seemed to carry less of the anger that had consumed her earlier. For the first time, she looked not just at the pastor but at the faces in the congregation. Some nodded in silent solidarity, others smiled gently as if to say, "We see you, and we're here." For the first time since she had burst into the church, her shoulders seemed to relax just a little. Though her pain was far from gone, a small part of her seemed to soften under the weight of the compassion she now felt surrounding her. The room was still, the woman's words hanging heavy in the air like an unspoken prayer. For a long moment, no one moved. The raw vulnerability she had shown left the congregation awestruck, unsure how to respond. Then slowly, a ripple of movement began. A woman in the front row reached into her bag, pulled out a tissue, and silently handed it to the woman. Another man, sitting toward the middle, removed his hat and bowed his head, murmuring words that sounded like a prayer. The pastor remained kneeling, his gaze never leaving the woman. "Thank you," he said quietly, his tone measured and sincere. "Thank you for sharing your story with us. You didn't have to, but you did, and that takes courage. I can't begin to fathom the depths of your pain, but I hope you can feel that you're not alone in it." The woman's hands shook as she accepted the tissue, dabbing at her eyes, though the tears kept coming. She seemed to struggle with his words, as if unsure whether to believe them. "Not alone," she finally echoed, her voice hoarse. "Do you know how many times people have said that to me? And every single time I still end up facing the darkness by myself." Her words were heavy, laced with bitterness and exhaustion, but there was also a faint note of yearning, a quiet hope that maybe this time things would be different. Sensing this, the pastor didn't rush to respond. Instead, he gave her the space to speak, letting her emotions fill the room. The woman looked around, her gaze landing on the faces of the congregation. "You all come here every Sunday," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You pray, you sing, you believe in this God who's supposed to be all-powerful and all-loving. But where was he when my son needed him? Where was he when I needed him?" Her questions hung in the air, piercing and unanswerable. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one interrupted. Then, a voice from the back of the church broke the silence. It belonged to an older woman with gray hair pulled back into a neat bun. She stood slowly, leaning on a cane, and addressed the grieving mother. "I don't have answers for you," the older woman said, her voice steady but kind. "I have asked the same questions myself. I lost my husband 10 years ago in a car accident, and I've spent every day since wondering why. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that faith doesn't mean never questioning. It means finding strength to keep going, even when the questions feel too big to bear." The grieving woman looked at her, surprised by the candidness of her words. Before she could respond, another voice joined in. This time, a younger man in his 20s. "I've been where you are," he said, standing hesitantly. My dad died when I was a teenager. I hated God for it. I stopped coming to church, stopped praying, stopped believing in anything. But then someone told me something I've never forgotten. That faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about holding on to hope when it feels like there's nothing left. The woman's expression softened, though her skepticism was still evident. "Hope?" she repeated, her voice almost a whisper. "What does hope do?" "It didn't save my son." "No," the young man admitted. "It didn't, and I'm so sorry for that. But hope isn't about changing the past. It's about finding a way forward." As more members of the congregation began to share their stories, their own moments of loss, doubt, and eventual healing, the atmosphere in the church shifted. The collective weight of their pain, shared openly, seemed to create a space where the grieving woman's anger and sorrow could be acknowledged without judgment. It was as if the walls of the church, built to hold hymns and prayers, now held something even more profound. The unspoken understanding that suffering is universal, and so is the need for connection. The pastor eventually spoke again, his voice steady. "You're right," he said. "Faith doesn't erase pain. It doesn't bring back those we've lost. But what it does do, what it can do, is remind us that we don't have to carry our pain alone. We're here for you, not just today, but tomorrow, and the day after that. You don't have to believe in God to let others support you. Let us help." For the first time since she had entered the church, the woman's posture relaxed slightly. She looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting with the crumpled tissue. "I don't know if I can," she said softly. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore." "You don't have to decide that today," the pastor replied. "Healing takes time, and trust, that takes time too. But every journey starts with a single step. Let this be yours." At that moment, a child's voice rang out from the front row. A little girl, no older than 5, stood up and walked over to the woman, her small hand holding a drawing she had been working on during the service. "This is for you," the girl said, her voice innocent and full of kindness. She held out the picture, a simple crayon drawing of a sun shining brightly over a smiling face. The woman stared at the drawing, her lip trembling as fresh tears welled up in her eyes. Slowly, she reached out and took it, clutching it as though it were a lifeline. The child smiled and returned to her seat, leaving behind a moment of pure, unfiltered humanity. The congregation watched in silence, their hearts collectively breaking and mending all at once. The woman didn't say anything more, but something had shifted in her. The walls she had built around her grief were still there, but a small crack had appeared, allowing the faintest glimmer of light to shine through. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, beginnings are all we need. As the woman sat clutching the crayon drawing, the weight of the moment settled over the church like a soft blanket. The air felt different, less charged, more grounded. The congregation watched her with quiet reverence, their collective compassion creating an invisible yet palpable bond. Though she had walked in with anger and despair, something within her had shifted, ever so slightly, during her time there. The walls she had built around her heart hadn't come crashing down, but they had been touched, softened by the unexpected kindness of strangers. The pastor remained nearby, his posture relaxed and unthreatening. He could sense that her journey wasn't one of immediate resolution. It was a fragile, tentative beginning. Slowly, he rose to his feet, addressing the congregation but keeping his focus on her. "What we've witnessed here today," he began, his voice steady, "is a reminder of why we come together as a community. Faith is not about certainty. It's not about never questioning or doubting. Faith is about being there for one another in the darkest of times." His words were met with nods from the parishioners. Some bowed their heads in reflection, while others continued to watch the woman, who seemed lost in thought. She traced the edges of the drawing with her fingers, her eyes unfocused as if trying to process everything that had happened. The pastor continued, "Today we've seen what happens when someone dares to speak their pain aloud, and we've seen what happens when we respond not with judgment, but with love. It doesn't matter whether you believe in God or even what you believe about the world. What matters is that we don't face it alone. The woman looked up, her eyes meeting his. She opened her mouth as if to speak but hesitated. For a moment, the words seemed caught in her throat. Finally, she managed, "I still don't know if I believe in any of this." Her voice was quieter now, less defiant but no less honest. "But I didn't think anyone would care enough to listen. I didn't think anyone would understand." The pastor smiled gently, nodding. "You don't have to believe," he said. "Not in this moment, not ever, if that's where your path leads you. Belief isn't something we can force. It's something that grows if it's meant to. What matters is that you feel seen, that you know your pain matters, and that you're not alone in it." The congregation began to stir slightly, as if collectively deciding what to do next. One by one, people started approaching the woman, not to overwhelm her, but to offer quiet, personal gestures of support. An elderly man leaned down and whispered a few words before giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze. A middle-aged woman placed a hand over her heart and nodded deeply, as though sending her silent encouragement. The young man who had spoken earlier knelt by her side. "I know you might not want it," he said softly, "but if you ever need someone to talk to, someone who gets it, I'm here. No pressure, no expectations." The woman glanced at him, surprised by his sincerity. "Thank you," she said, her voice almost inaudible. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied with a small smile. "Sometimes just being here is enough." As the moments passed, the tension in the room began to dissipate. The woman seemed less guarded now, her posture less rigid. Though her pain was still evident, etched into every line of her face, it no longer felt as though it defined her completely. She had walked into the church with the weight of her grief pressing down on her, but now it seemed she had begun to share that weight with others. The little girl who had given her the drawing skipped back over, her pigtails bouncing. "You can keep it forever," she said brightly. "It's for you." The woman managed a small, shaky smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She held the picture close to her chest, as though it were a treasure. The pastor took a step closer, his hands clasped in front of him. "You don't have to decide anything today," he said gently. "Just know that our doors are always open. Whether you come to sit, to talk, or to yell at God, whatever you need, you're welcome here." The woman nodded, a faint glimmer of gratitude in her eyes. "I don't know if I'll come back," she admitted. "But thank you for listening, for not pushing me away." "You're always welcome," the pastor said simply. As she stood to leave, several members of the congregation quietly offered their goodbyes, some with words, others with small gestures, a hand on her arm, a warm smile, a quiet nod. The woman hesitated at the door, looking back at the room one last time. It wasn't the same place she had stormed into earlier. It felt different, warmer, less intimidating. A place where for the first time in a long time, she hadn't felt entirely alone. She walked out into the sunlight, the crayon drawing still clutched tightly in her hands. The world outside felt as uncertain as ever, but something inside her had shifted. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the faintest whisper of possibility. A possibility that healing was not only imaginable, but perhaps even attainable. And for now, that was enough.